Berg and Pat Hudson. So Pat Hudson is Emeritus Professor at the School of History, Archaeology and Religion at Cardiff University. She specialises in economic history and has worked extremely extensively on the history of the Industrial Revolution. Along with her co-presenter Maxine Berg, she co-authored Slavery, Capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, which was published with Polity Press last year. And then Maxine Berg is Professor of History at Warwick University. Her research, which is again very extensive, is focused on trade and empire, consumer culture in the 18th century, manufacturing and industrialization. And I'm sorry the introductions are quite brief, but I'm sure they'll want to speak more about their book. So I'm going to hand the floor over to them. And again, Maxine, Pat, just let me know when you want your slides up.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Katie. I will just start off. Pat and I, we're very grateful for this opportunity to open this conference to present our book on slavery, capitalism, and the Industrial Revolution. As you said, it was published nearly a year ago now, and we really welcome this opportunity to engage with the book and discussions on public history. We started research on this book during COVID and during the Black Lives Matter protests of the spring and in Britain in June 2020. The book was researched and written very quickly. And the key thing was for us that Black Lives Matter was not just about the legacy of race in America. It was about Britain. There was, of course, the protests over the statue of Edward Colston, a lot of investigation coinciding with this from many institutions in Britain, universities, commercial companies, the Church of England, into the background of slave profits in their in the making of their companies, their institutions, etc. But at the time, there was no accessible text or even article that covered the whole economy, the whole of Britain, as a background to assessment of any of this debate that was going on. There was nothing there to recommend to our students and to a wider the wider public. So this was the background for us writing this book. In the year that's followed, there's been a lot of pushback, but it remains the case that this is, we think, the only treatment that we have that covers recent, all of it, the recent research which Katie has raised in her introduction, and recent data that covers the whole economy and covers as well the whole of Britain. So with no further ado, I just want to thank the organizers for providing a forum here for a reasoned and evidenced debate on this issue of slavery and public issue. So now I turn over to Pat, who will tell you much more about the book. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Could I have the next slide, please, Katie? So our book examines not just the impact of slavery on the industrialization period in Britain, and by Britain, as Maxine has kept banging on, it's really important, we felt, to cover Scotland, Wales, and to some extent Ireland, as well as England in this research and assessment. It doesn't just cover the period of industrialization, but also the long-term development of the British economy and society, well beyond the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in the British territories, in most of the British territories, in the 1830s. As you can see from the chapter titles here, we cover global patterns of unequal trade set in motion by the slave trade. We consider the direct and indirect impact on a wide range of industries, consumer goods, commercial and financial services, and we show that this caused a regional reorientation of the British economy in favour of the north and west in the hinterlands of the Atlantic ports, and especially emphasising Lancashire, West Yorkshire and the Scottish lowlands. Next slide. The main arguments of the book are firstly that Britain's involvement with the slave trade and slave labour colonies in the 18th century had a systemic impact on the British economy. In other words, it had an impact that can't be measured solely, as has often been attempted, in terms of capital flows or of monetary costs and benefits. Secondly, sugar before cotton, and again, cotton is more often highlighted in treatments, rightly so to some degree, but sugar before cotton and the Caribbean before the American South drove the engines of early British wealth formation and institution building. And both of these were foundational to all that followed. Thirdly, plantation innovation and the knowledge economy of Atlantic science were, as we try to demonstrate, part and parcel of the agrarian and industrial revolutions, which are so often considered as just a phenomena internal to the British Isles, if not just to England. And fourthly, the slave-based trades of the 18th century were responsible for linking the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans, for extending global trade in manufactures and primary products, and in transferring new ideas and technologies over longer distances. Next slide. So, turning to the focus of today's workshop, how might the book help to reassess and reinterpret industrial and built environment heritage sites, as well as contribute to changing educational curricula? I recently gave a talk at a big conference in Bangor of World Heritage Site professionals. And the UK, I discovered, I wasn't aware, has something like 27 World Heritage Sites, 7 of which are mainly industrial. So I had a look before I spoke at this conference at the websites of those 7 areas, and also at the pamphlets and literature that you can buy to accompany visits to those sites. And I was struck by the complete absence of a context of global trade in the background description of these World Heritage Sites, the industrial ones. There was very little mention of colonialism and empire. And even though, as well as global trade, even though those forces together were largely responsible for the rise and later development of all of the sites in question, which range from, you know, the iron sites of South Wales, the slate quarrying areas of North Wales, the maritime history of Greenwich, all of the, you know, I could go on, there are many, there are 7 of these sites, but very little attention is paid in the interpretation of the sites to their context in global trade and colonialism, including coerced labour. So I sort of brought out 3 points for this brief introduction that I thought might illustrate how the book might assist in interpreting and looking at industrial and built environment heritage sites. First of all, by indicating the impact of slavery, I think, on not only on a wide range of industries and specialised industrial landscapes, as is common, for example, with the cotton areas of South Lancashire, and many other industries that are less obviously directly connected, but also if we are exploring, for example, commercial and financial built environments in the UK, looking at, for example, insurance houses, banks, commodity exchanges, port buildings, docks, canals, all of these should have some reference to the background of 18th century colonialism and global trade. Secondly, I think the book could assist by documenting, as it does, that millions of workers in a range of industries and services, not just manufacturing, but also banking, retailing, etc., as well as the slave traders and slave plantation owners themselves, that are often the main focus, and in all parts of Britain, these people all had their lives changed by slavery. Waged work in shipping, banking, insurance, transport, wholesaling and retailing, as well as manufacturing, expanded massively in the 18th century on the back of a global trade that was in turn largely based upon the movement of coerced labour of enslaved peoples from the West African coast to the Caribbean and what became the southern states. These areas of the economy expanded, but so also, of course, did consumption habits and patterns across the social spectrum, which were transformed by slave-cultivated Atlantic produce. And this stimulated a range of manufactured products industries and is responsible, hence, for a range of artifacts in our museums and other heritage sites that cannot be interpreted without reference to slavery. I'll come back in a second to what they might be and what we should perhaps highlight and look out for. Thirdly, I think the book helps by highlighting the early systemic and enduring impact of chattel slavery, and by acknowledging that this set in train later patterns of imperial investment using racially based coerced labour to extract primary produce in other parts of the globe in the 19th century and into the 20th century. And I do think that's often missed in looking at or assessing slavery, that it laid the foundation for a whole pattern of imperial investments and the use of coerced labour in other forms. In terms of education, I was thinking that a new approach might involve, in which the book might help, might involve starting with well-known commodities and artifacts, such as sugar, molasses, cocoa, coffee, rice, tea, and the equipment necessary for their polite consumption, brass and tinware snuff boxes, clay pipes, ceramic and pewter coffee and tea sets, sugar basins, silver and less fancy, sugar spoons and tongs, mahogany tea and coffee tables. All these things cannot be interpreted without reference to the enslaved people who produced these commodities and who in turn, these primary products came into Britain, were processed, creating many new processing industries, but also their consumption required a whole range of new manufactures. And then I think if we acknowledge those commodities and new manufactures, we could then teach history backwards, as it were, to show how each commodity or object links to slavery. And the same could be done with printed cottons and fashions of the late 18th and into the 19th centuries, and indeed with a whole array of heritage landscapes. Now, I do have a few minutes' time, I was wondering if I might, to introduce just very briefly some examples from Wales, which is obviously where I'm based now, and have been for some years, although it's not my original home, but it's my adopted home. Wales makes a very good case study for our purposes, not because it was the centre by any means of British slave trade activity or slave-derived wealth or investment, but because, and precisely because, it was not. And yet, the development of Welsh industries and society in the 18th and 19th centuries was in many respects dependent on slavery. So it's a very good location for case studies which show the indirect as much as the direct impact of slave-based commerce in the 18th century on industrial heritage, landscapes, and artifacts. The 18th century domestic textile industry in Wales was very largely dependent for about a century on the export of durable, cheap Welsh plains, so-called, that were developed specifically for clothing the enslaved on Atlantic plantations. And this was responsible, therefore, for giving a fundamental, if you like, stimulus to the Welsh economy, because the textile industry was dispersed throughout Wales, but particularly in central Wales. And eventually this trade was dominated by Liverpool merchants, who became, as it were, putting out factors in the industry, and then these cloths were exported largely via Liverpool. Can we have the next slide, please? The next industry that I would mention is copper mining and smelting. This is the remains now of the big Paris mine on Anglesey, which was probably, well, it was the biggest copper mine in the world in its time, and dominated the extraction of copper in Britain for about 2 decades, 2 to 3 decades. It was soon worked out. Copper mining and smelting grew in Wales in the 18th century, partly to serve the needs of sugar processing, both in the Caribbean and back in the UK, in the finer sugar processing processes, because copper was the favoured metal, obviously, for the big vessels that were needed for boiling and reboiling this material. The copper industry in the Elizabethan period was almost negligible, but in the 18th century it came to life on the back of the slave-based Atlantic sugar trade. And copper was also given a huge fillip in the 18th century by the copper bottoming of Royal Navy and Merchant Navy ships, which were suffering in the trade in tropical waters from depredation from the Teradis worm, which ate away at the wood. So copper bottoming came in the third quarter of the 18th century and was a major stimulus to sites like Paris Mine, but also, of course, in the south of Wales, there grew some of the earliest industrial communities in the world, in the Swansea Valley, where copper smelting became the dominant industry, and for a time, South Wales dominated world copper smelting and export on the back of this early stimulus from the transatlantic trade. Next slide. Thank you. This is an example from North Wales of the Greenfield Valley near Holywell, which was the site not just of copper works, brass and hollowware works, but also of textiles, which I mentioned earlier, all focused around export via Liverpool for both the slave trade to Africa and the transatlantic slave-based Atlantic markets. Next slide. The iron industry of South Wales also received a major stimulus, partly indeed because of the demand for iron from the expansion of the Royal Navy, the need for munitions, and the whole panoply of investment in mercantilism and the defence of the transatlantic colonial empire. And this was a large part of the reason behind the huge expansion and technological transformation of the iron industries in South Wales, and perhaps important also to say that these were industries that needed a lot of initial investment, and this came largely from the wealth that had been created, particularly in Bristol, but also in London, by the sugar trade, and probably would not have flourished in South Wales without those links. And finally, perhaps my favourite, because we're coming back here, next slide, to consumer goods. Alongside the many artifacts and small consumer items that were required for the consumption of the new transatlantic colonial groceries, were those made from tin plate, of which iron, of course, in Wales was one of the main ingredients, but tin also. Now, tin plate in the UK, although it became most famous for being produced in the Midlands and around Birmingham, especially this type of variety in these illustrations, the Japan decorative tinware, was actually pioneered in Pontypool in South Wales before it spread into the English Midlands. And it was really the demand for the new consumption habits and patterns of the era of new colonial groceries, sugar, tea, coffee, cacao, that gave the pressure to innovate in these decorative wares. And these spread from Pontypool to other parts of South Wales and provided the foundation, in fact, for the later development of South Wales as the world leader in tin plate manufacture for almost a century. And that includes in my small part of Wales in Carmarthenshire near Llanelli, where the major tin plate factories were sited in the 19th century. Okay, could you advance to the last slide? I'd like to thank you for listening to this brief survey of what the book contains and how it might relate to public history. Thank you very much indeed. If you want to buy a copy of the book and you haven't got it, there's a code there, MPA 30, which will give you a discount if you buy direct from Polity. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Maxine and Pat, for getting us off to a really interesting and provocative start. So I'm going to now share my screen again. And this time we are going to hear instead from Professor Corinne Fowler. So Corinne is Professor of Colonialism and Heritage at the University of Leicester. She specialises in the relationship between colonial history, decolonisation and the British countryside. She directed a child-led history project called Colonial Countryside, which some of you may know later went on. It was a partnership with the National Trust, later went on to publish the report into the National Trust's connections to slavery and empire. Her latest book is Our Island Story, Country Walks Through Colonial Britain, and that was published by Penguin this year. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you'll all be able to access Corinne's latest work. Okay. And Holly, please give me a shout if there's any problems and people can't hear.
Hello, everybody. I'm really sorry that I can't be there today, but I've recorded this talk and hope that my work might be a useful resource for you as you start thinking through how to combine the teaching of the history of slavery with the Industrial Revolution. So I will just share my screen. So I've called my talk From Copper to Cotton, and I'll concentrate mostly on copper and cotton. I just wanted to start with a little bit of background so I can explain sort of how I ended up where I did. One of the projects that I had is called Colonial Countryside, and it finished recently, but it's a child-led history and writing project, and we were working with the National Trust and a team of historians, including Katie Donington, who were helping us to uncover and explore the colonial histories of National Trust houses. And several of those houses had transatlantic slavery connections. And a prime example, which sort of begins to get me thinking about the connections between slavery and the British countryside in particular, is Penrhyn Castle in North Wales near Bangor. It was one of 10 houses that I went to with 100 primary pupils, 10 in each country house. And what we learned about that has been known for some 25 years, that it's a story of sugar and slate, as the National Trust puts it. But that history is a really interesting example of how important the wealth of that house is in terms of its connections between Jamaican sugar plantations in Clarendon over there with the slate mine, the slate quarry near the castle. So the overarching story there is that Lord Penrhyn and his family had held these sugar plantations for many years, and as soon as Lord Penrhyn inherited his slavery wealth, he then immediately started excavating and preparing the quarry to be quarried near the castle, and it is a very important part of the industrial history of the area, including the fiercest and probably most bitter industrial conflict and strike, which lasted some time and was really an upsetting event for lots of people, and is still remembered in that location today. And with the children, we looked at various objects in the house which connect to that slavery history. And what the children wrote poems, and one of them called Fatima here, who was in year 6 at the time, she wrote this poem about Lord Penrhyn. He had money, I had history. His money bought my history, which I think is just a brilliant exploration of historiography, a really nice critique of how it all can work sometimes. So I think I just wanted to start with that example because it's quite a useful way into the topic. I'm thinking a bit more laterally about it. So all of the stuff that I'm talking about today is drawn from my new book, Our Island Stories, Country Walks Through Colonial Britain. And I've got some pictures of those walks there on the slide. The idea of the book was to explore 10 different parts of the country and to walk with companions who have ancestral connections to empire, and to look at the local history of slavery and other aspects of colonialism in those 10 walks. So I'll show you the title slide there. We've got the Sugar Walk, the Wordsworth, the East India Company Walk, and so on. And the way that I've sort of ordered it is to really look at colonial history's relevance to rural scenes and settings, but it also helps us to connect, as I say, local history to slavery history in the case of this talk. So although I cover quite a wide range of stuff, so I cover the history of romantic poetry with the walk in the lakes there. I cover the history of trade with my sugar walk and my tobacco walk, the history of finance with the bankers walk in Hampshire and linking that to Louisiana, and the history of production. I think about wool, which has, of course, in North Wales near Dolgellau, a really important connection but to slavery, because the wool from the woolen plains, which is a particularly kind of coarse woolen fabric, was used primarily to clothe enslaved people in the Americas, as has been explored in Slave Wales by Chris Evans and other academics like Marion Gwynn, who are specialists in Welsh colonial and slavery history. And they, I sort of cover the history of labourers as well, and also the enclosure walk there that I did in Suffolk and Norfolk is looking at the connection between slave ownership and one of the biggest legacies of colonialism more broadly, and slavery in particular, in Britain, which is land ownership. So many slave owners then used the wealth, and their families who inherited that wealth then used that wealth to expand their country estates and to throw people off the common land during the period of enclosure. So I've looked at all of those sorts of things, and what I want to hone in on today is two particular walks and two particular stories. One at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, my copper walk, and the other one at the end of the Industrial Revolution, or in the second half of the Industrial Revolution, my cotton walk. So my cotton walk, as I say, it starts at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because the history of copper mining goes back a very long way, but it's also very significant to labour history. So sort of later on during the copper excavation period, by 1800, a third of Cornwall's workforce were employed in that copper industry. And so I start my walk near in Busfield, near Gwenap, which is a really important kind of historical site of industrial sites in this period. And between 1780 and 1800, this square mile was known as the richest square mile on earth, widely known as that. And the reason that cotton was so important, as I'm sure you know, was because it had important uses and applications, because it was very malleable. So I started the walk, you know, sort of to the top of the map there. I've got maps for each walk so that they can be followed. I start near Redruth, which is kind of where all the engineers and miners used to live during the copper period. Walking through the village of Gwenap, starting in Gwenap Pit there, which is very famous because John Wesley, sorry, used to preach in that pit. And through this industrial landscape, as you can see, a diagram, you know, a photograph at the bottom part of the slide there showing the kind of remnants of industry. This employed, as I say, an awful lot of people, and it's got a very important social history. The people who were miners moved to the area, and they lived as close to the mine as possible because it was incredibly hard labour. They climbed down from the surface of the mine on these ladders, often with very wide rungs, and it would sometimes take an hour to get to the part which they were excavating. It was very dangerous work. They had to put the explosive there and then withdraw and wait for the copper to be released in the explosion, and then to gather the ore, and it would be lifted back to the surface. But it often took even longer to climb back up again, often in heavy wet clothes, and then you wanted to live as close to the mine surface as possible because you didn't want to walk a long way home after that. So there are many, the population really swelled around these places. I think it's important to say that the although copper was used domestically, it had very important and significant uses internationally, globally. So, you know, over half or just over half of all the copper that was produced in the 18th century was used in those global contexts. So it's not all just about copper kettles and so on. So one of its uses in by 1700 was in West Indian plantations, where 100 tons of copper was used annually for the massive copper vats, which boiled the sugar, for the copper utensils, for the distilleries as well, especially later on. It was used in these enormous containers that were required to boil and process the sugar. As I say, by 1729, over half of copper was exported globally. And then in 1732, if you look at just one estate, to get a sugar estate in St. Kitts, just to get an idea of the quantity that was being exported, just one St. Kitts estate was using £1,000 worth of copper equipment. So, you know, by 1770, you had, you know, roughly 32,000 boiling cauldrons, each containing 180 gallons of boiling sugar. So that then is connected to the London coppersmiths, who used to get these orders to make these vats. They used to beat the sheets of copper into the requisite shapes according to the size of the order. But academics have also looked at other global applications for this, which are connected to slavery specifically and colonialism more generally. So one of the important uses of copper was for sheathing sailing ships, because the problem with these wooden hulls in tropical waters was that they would deteriorate, and there was a big worm called shipworm which used to eat into the wood. And so one of the solutions to this, as well as to all the barnacles which attached to the bottom of the ship, was to sheathe it with copper, and the ship would last longer and it would sail faster and it would deteriorate at a much slower rate and sort of last a few years longer than it would otherwise have done. By 1779, the entire Navy was sheathed in this copper. So the orders were immense, the amount of copper required, and Cornwall was certainly able to produce it alongside Wales, which was also an important producer of copper. It's important to say that the Navy was those naval ships were often fighting colonial wars. So there are many other colonial connections that can be followed. But specifically in the 18th century, the copper was used at the bottom of slave ships, and that made the voyages much faster. And in a kind of callous commercial balance sheet way, the faster you could sail the ship. I don't even like to say you, because it encourages identification with those who were sailing the ships. But the faster the ship could be sailed across the Atlantic, the less enslaved Africans would die on the voyage, and the more callous profit could be made from their enslavement by those who were factors, sort of selling on enslaved human beings. So that was an important use. Copper was also used as a form of exchange on the West African coast, and it was very important and highly valued part of that transaction at the beginning of that transatlantic voyage, in paying for or exchanging in part of that transaction for enslaved people. So I have got a picture there of a row of sugar boiling coppers at New River Plantation in Nevis. And then at the top of the slide, there is also a picture of James Watt's steam engine. This is an important part of the story, which kind of leads me to the copper, because the James Watt steam engine and many other engines which were competing engines, which never kind of were as effective as James Watt's engine, were the copper mines, because the copper mines had been excavated for centuries, and because of that they were very deep. They used to flood with water and they needed to pump out that water. So although we associate James Watt's steam engine with the factories and things like the production of cotton, it's actually what drove it was this global copper industry in speeding up the development of a machine that was powerful enough to pump out the water from those kinds of depths. So you can't see that steam engine, which was also later used on the plantations too, which is part of the story, but you can't see it in isolation from this copper story. My cotton walk, as I'll try to be succinct because I don't want to talk for more than my time. It runs from the village of Darwin, and I did this walk with an artist called Barty Palmer. And we started in Darwin at a mill called India Mill, and as you can see from the map, we walked all the way around Darwin Moor and along to a place called Springvale Garden Village. So the story of cotton is a really complicated one when it comes to Darwin. This is East Lancashire, and we've got many phrases to do with cotton, which was really the most important textile and export and profit making fabric at the end of the in the second half of the Industrial Revolution. But we talk about they've got all these phrases that cotton is king, and hell is pure white, because we know how bad those factories were. And there's a picture in the bottom left hand corner of India Mill, and it's so named because Darwin really tells a story of two continents. Well, first you have the history of the Confederate States in the southern states of America and the American Civil War, and of course all the raw cotton up until 1860 that was coming into those factories in East Lancashire and providing all that work, albeit absolutely horrible work in the factories and exploitative work, was coming from enslaved labour in the Deep South. And to be more accurate, the southern states. And so when the Civil War happened, that supply of raw cotton was cut off and could no longer be transported in through the ports of Manchester and Liverpool. And so the factories ground to a halt, and there was a very famous period known as the Cotton Famine. Again, it's important to remember that these factories were, when they were working, driven by James Watt's steam engine and other engines which were developed as a result of that technology, and that the whole industry was incredibly lucrative for the nation and central to it. And for that reason, Britain took a neutral stance in the American Civil War, because they didn't want to harm the cotton industry. They knew that the cotton industry was so important to the economy. During the cotton famine, obviously, all of those people who were involved in the cotton fabric, the making of the cotton fabric in different stages within the factories, were given poor relief. Their nutrition declined, their living standards declined. It was a really distressing situation for many people. You know, there's reports, if you read all the local history reports, of people burning their own furniture because they haven't got any fuel left for the fire. All kinds of humiliations and deprivations because of that cotton famine. All of this is connected, and it's really, you know, as I've written about this in detail in my book, it's a brilliant way into showing the connections between labour history and slavery history. And just to kind of complete the story, I said that Darwin's history of cotton, and indeed in East Lancashire's history of cotton, is linked to two continents. So when the cotton stopped from the blockaded ports in the southern states of America, the cotton was then brought from India. And there's a whole story also about how Gandhi later boycotted cotton from Britain and called for a boycott, and there was a burning of Manchester cloth, you know, as it was called, British made clothes. So there were bonfires everywhere. And the factory owners in Darwin invited Gandhi during his visit to the UK to negotiate Indian independence. They invited him to their factories, and he actually persuaded them that the situation in India justified the boycott, that he was sorry that it was hurting local people, but the local people at least had some kind of funds and they still were in houses and so on, whereas Indians were living in terrible poverty. And he really won them over, as you can see from that picture there. And that part of the story is also fascinating. But I'll stop there. I just wanted to open up some possibilities for making those connections. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so that is Corinne's discussion there, which she has given us in film form. So I'm not going to take up any time by asking my own questions. I think I'm going to hand straight over to Holly, who